The woman at the registration desk looked at him the way people look at something that doesn't quite fit where it's landed. Not hostile, just the particular kind of still that happens when a face is deciding something faster than it should. Holden Keane was 41 years old. He was standing at the entrance of the Harrington Club's Grand Hall in Nashville, wearing a dark Carhartt jacket that had seen better days, jeans with a bleached smear on the left knee that hadn't come out in the wash, and boots that had actual mud dried in the seam where the sole met the upper. He was carrying a canvas tote bag over one shoulder. Walking beside him, one hand wrapped around two of his fingers like she always did in crowds, was Tess. Tess Keane was 9 years old and had her mother's stubborn brown eyes and her father's habit of examining things longer than most people did before deciding what she thought about them. She was wearing a red fleece pullover and a t-shirt underneath that "Read Future Mechanic" in faded block letters. Holden had bought it for her at the Detroit Auto Show when she was 6, and she'd worn it past the point of reasonable sizing because she said it still fit if she raised her arms carefully. She had a small backpack shaped like a tire. The Grand Hall of the Harrington Club was not a place that advertised itself from the outside. No signage on the street, no valet stand visible from the sidewalk, no indication that behind the limestone facade of this 1920s building on West End Avenue sat one of the most exclusive automotive preservation societies in the American South. Membership was by invitation only. Events were ticketed by personal recommendation. The people who came here knew exactly where they were going and had been welcomed before. Holden had been invited 8 weeks ago by letter on cream-colored stationery from the desk of August Pemberton, chairman of the American Automotive Heritage Foundation. The letter had been 12 sentences long and had offered Holden Keane the singular distinction of having his restoration of a 1965 Mustang Fastback designated as the featured centerpiece of the Foundation's annual showcase. It had also included, in the final paragraph, the terms of a potential preservation partnership worth well over $1 million in annual contracts, contingent on the outcome of the evening. He had read it twice at the workbench in his garage in Millhaven, Tennessee, standing in the smell of motor oil and solvent with a coffee going cold next to his socket wrench set. None of that was visible on him as he walked through the lobby doors. The woman at the registration desk had dark hair pulled back sharply and wore a blazer with the Harrington Club crest on the breast pocket. She was perhaps 30, with the particular polish of someone who managed events for a living and had calibrated her expression to project competence without warmth. She was looking down at a tablet when Holden and Tess approached. When she looked up, there was a fraction of a second she didn't entirely recover from before her professional expression reassembled itself. Her eyes moved, jacket, boots, the child, the tote bag, back to his face. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was pleasant in the way a smooth wall is pleasant, nothing to hold on to. "I'm on the guest list," Holden said. Holden Keane. She looked at her tablet. Her finger moved down the screen. "Is this for the catering staff check-in?" "That entrance would be." "I'm a guest," Holden said, "not catering." She looked at him again. That look was specific, the kind that runs a quick calculation and arrives at a conclusion it's confident in, even when the confidence isn't warranted. "I have a Mr. Keane listed as a featured presenter. You'd be—" She let the sentence trail off in a way that completed itself without her finishing it. "That's me." The pause that followed was 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Holden watched her decide something, and what she decided was not that she'd been wrong. It was that she needed more information before accepting she'd been wrong, which was a different thing altogether. "I'll need to verify your identification," she said. "Standard procedure." He handed her his Tennessee driver's license without comment. She studied it in the same way. People study things they're hoping will give them a different answer than the one they're getting. "And the child." "Tess," he said, "my daughter." Tess had been looking at the cars displayed on podiums through the open hall doors. She turned at her name. "Hi," she said to the woman with the frank sociability of a kid who hasn't yet learned to match the room's energy. "Is that a Shelby Cobra in there?" The woman didn't answer her. She handed Holden's license back. "There should be a confirmation code," she said, "from the Foundation." "There is. Kira sent it with my registration packet 3 weeks ago." It should be in your system. He said it evenly. His voice had the quality of someone who is waiting rather than arguing. He'd spent 17 years in automotive engineering rooms, where being the youngest person at the table meant you learned to wait for the moment to speak rather than fighting for space. I'm having trouble locating it, the woman said. Her name is Kira Dalton. She handles my operations. You're welcome to call her directly. That won't be necessary, but she didn't hand him his badge or step aside. What's your name? Holden asked. A pause. Blair. Blair. He nodded once. I have a presentation in 45 minutes. Whatever you need to do to verify this, I'd appreciate you doing it now. Blair reached for the phone on her desk. Tess looked up at Holden with the particular expression she used when adults were being confusing. Is there a problem? She said quietly. She's making sure we're supposed to be here, Holden said. We are, though. I know that. Then why? She doesn't know it yet, he said. Give her a minute. What Holden did not know in that moment, what nobody in that lobby knew, was that Blair Weston was not simply an event manager. She had been the director of experiential programming for the Harrington Club for 3 years, had planned 47 events of this scale or larger, and had in that time developed a particular unconscious shorthand for reading a room quickly. She was, by any reasonable measure, good at her job. She had built her professional reputation on precision and on never letting the wrong person into the wrong space. She also had a blind spot, the kind that isn't visible from the inside because it wears the costume of professionalism and calls itself instinct. She had looked at Holden Keane in the first second and made a decision about what she was seeing. And she had not stopped making that decision. She made 2 calls. The second one reached someone who had actually looked at the registration file. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. When she put the phone down, her face had gone still in a different way than before. Not the careful stillness of competence, but the stillness of someone who is running the tape back and watching where they took the wrong turn. Your registration is confirmed, she said. Her voice was very controlled. I apologize for the delay. Thank you, Holden said. He picked up the badge she slid across the desk, took Tess's hand, and walked through the hall doors. The hall was beautiful in the particular way that spaces built for things people love are beautiful. The ceiling was 20 feet of original plaster molding. The lighting had been designed specifically for the cars on display, 18 restorations from across the country, each on its own lit platform, each tagged with its history. At the far end of the hall, under a single focus spot, was Holden's car. The 1965 Mustang Fastback had arrived at his garage 14 months ago as a rusted shell on a flatbed. It had come from an estate sale in Kentucky, the grandson of the original owner letting go of something his grandfather had parked in a barn in 1978 and never moved again. What Holden had found under the rust was a car that had been well loved before it was forgotten, and he had worked on it the way he worked on everything in the garage. Alone, methodical, in the hours after Tess was in bed. The paint was Wimbledon white, mixed to original 1965 formula. The chrome had been stripped and replated. The engine had been rebuilt down to the last gasket. It had taken 14 months, and it was the best thing he'd ever made. Tess walked toward it and stood in front of it with her arms crossed and her chin up, evaluating. It looks good, Dad, she said. It does, he agreed. Better than in the garage. The lighting helps. She considered the car for another moment. That lady at the desk was weird. He looked at her. He'd learned in the 4 years since her mother died to be careful about what he said to Tess in moments like this. She was 9 and she processed things. She held on to what she heard. She made a call about us before she knew who we were, he said. About how we look. More or less. Tess frowned at the car. That's not fair. No, he said. It's not. Are you mad? He thought about that honestly. He had a rule with Tess about honest answers. Her mother had insisted on it when Tess was very small, and he'd carried it forward as one of the things he kept, not because she'd asked him to, but because it was right. A little, he said, but not the kind of mad that needs to go anywhere, so I'm just going to let it sit. She nodded once. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small sketchbook. She had started drawing car schematics when she was 7, rough and proportionally optimistic, but recognizable. She was drawing his Mustang before he'd finished his sentence. Holden stood next to her and watched the room fill. At 6:52, Kira Dalton walked through the main doors. She was 44, with the particular authority of someone who had decided a long time ago not to apologize for taking up space. She was carrying a leather portfolio, and her reading glasses were pushed up on her head. She had been Sarah Keane's roommate in college and had stayed close to the family in the way that real friendship sometimes outlasts everything it was built around. She had come to work with Holden 2 years ago when his operation grew past the point of him managing it alone. She ran the numbers, the contracts, the communications. He built the cars. She found Holden near the Mustang and stood next to him. "How was the drive up?" she said. "Fine." There was a thing at the door. Kira looked at him. She had been around him long enough to know what a thing meant in that tone. "What kind of thing?" He told her briefly. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the measured tone she used when she was deciding how much energy to spend on something, "Do you want me to handle it?" "Not unless something else happens," he said. She nodded and opened her portfolio. "Pemberton confirmed this afternoon. He wants to meet after your presentation. The partnership terms are the same as the proposal. He just wants to shake your hand." Holden looked at the car. 8 figures of restoration contracts over 5 years. Work for craftsmen he'd been quietly assembling a network of for the past 2 years. People in small shops in places like Millhaven who knew how to do things that were being forgotten. He'd structured the whole pitch around that. "Good," he said. It was at 7:11, just as the formal program was beginning, that Blair crossed the hall toward where Holden and Tess were standing. She moved with the brisk purposefulness of someone who had decided a problem was solvable and was coming to solve it. She stopped near Tess. "Excuse me," she said. "For the presentation portion of the evening, we're going to need all non-registered guests to move to the hospitality area." She glanced briefly at Tess. "It's a liability issue. Children in the hall during the featured unveil." "She's registered," Holden said. "Her name is on my guest credentials." Blair looked at him. "I checked, and the registration only covers." "You checked wrong," he said. "She's registered as my +1. Tess Keane. She's been on the list since the confirmation packet." Blair held her tablet in both hands. "Our policy for minors during live presentations." "Is not what you're describing," Holden said. His voice had not changed in volume or temperature, and he was aware of that, was actively keeping it there. Not for Blair's benefit, but because Tess was standing 2 feet away. He had decided, somewhere in the last 4 years, that the way he handled unfair things was one of the most important lessons he was ever going to teach her. There is no policy that would require a 9-year-old to leave a room her father is presenting in. If there is, I'll read it right now. "Show me." Blair said nothing. "Why does she have to move?" Holden asked. He wasn't asking for a real answer anymore. He was asking because he wanted to see what Blair would do when she ran out of real answers. Blair was quiet for long enough that the silence answered the question. "This is my daughter," Holden said quietly. "She has a right to be in this room. She has a right to watch her father's work. And she's going to stand right here for the entire presentation. If there's a legitimate reason she can't, I'll listen to it. If there isn't, I'd like you to go back to your desk." Something moved across Blair's face. Not quite the beginning of realization. Something before it. The moment a person starts to feel the ground shift and doesn't yet know which direction it's shifting. "I'm going to need to speak with my event coordinator," she said. "Do that," Holden said. He turned back to the car. Tess was watching Blair walk away. She waited until Blair was out of earshot. "She tried to make me leave," Tess said. "She tried. You didn't let her." "No." Tess looked at her sketchbook, at the half-finished drawing of the Mustang. "Dad," she said, "when I get my own garage one day," she said it with the certainty of a kid who has never questioned the assumption. "Is it going to be hard like this?" He looked at her for a long moment. She had paint from an old project still on her left thumbnail. Her hair was in a ponytail that was beginning to come undone on one side. She had her mother's way of asking questions that were actually statements in disguise. "Sometimes," he said. But you'll know who you are. That's the thing that matters. If you know who you are, other people being wrong about it is their problem, not yours. She thought about that. Did Mom know who she was? The question landed the way her questions sometimes did, without warning, without malice, precise in a way that left no room for a deflecting answer. Yeah, he said, she really did. At 7:29, two members of the Harrington Club's private security team appeared at the hall entrance. They were polite in the way of people who have been given incomplete information and are trying to proceed carefully. Blair was behind them. Holden set his coffee down and walked to meet them. He kept his posture open. His hands were visible. He had done enough negotiating in enough difficult rooms to know that the geometry of a confrontation mattered. "Gentlemen," he said, "I think there's been some confusion. The simplest way to sort this out is to look at the registration file, Keane, Keane. Or you can call Kira Dalton." He turned slightly, and Kira was already walking across the room toward them, leather portfolio under her arm. "Who's right here?" Kira arrived before either security officer had to make a decision. She opened the portfolio on a nearby display table. She didn't perform it. She just laid out what was in it. "Keane Restorations, LLC," she said, pointing to the top of the first page. "Millhaven, Tennessee. Holden Keane, founder and sole proprietor. Former senior systems engineer, Great Lakes Automotive Group, 12 years. Restoration contracts in the current fiscal year." She turned to the next page, totaling just under $2 million. "Featured restorer, American Automotive Heritage Foundation Annual Showcase, by personal invitation of Chairman August Pemberton." She closed the portfolio. The hall was quiet in the particular way that rooms get quiet when something has just become clear to everyone in them. Blair was looking at Holden. She had gone pale in the specific way of someone who has run the tape back and found the error and is now experiencing the full weight of it. The security officers signed off and left. Kira gave Holden a look that communicated precisely that she had thoughts about this she would share at a more appropriate time. Then she walked back across the hall. Holden looked at Blair. "I'm not going to make this into anything," he said. His voice was quiet. "That's not useful, but I need to ask you for one thing." She waited. "Tell Tess you were wrong," he paused. "Not me, her." The expression that crossed Blair's face in that moment was complicated in a way that had nothing to do with performance. She was 32 years old, and she had spent a decade building something she was genuinely proud of, and in the last hour she had used that pride to do something she was not going to be able to convince herself was reasonable. She turned toward Tess. Tess had put her sketchbook away. She was watching Blair with the steady, unguarded eyes of a child who has learned that watching closely is how you understand what adults are actually like. "I'm sorry," Blair said. Her voice was not steady. "I treated you like you didn't belong here. That was wrong. You belong here." She paused. "Your dad's car is the best one in the room." Tess looked at her for a moment. "I know," she said. "And then, is the Cobra over there a 62 or a 63? What nobody in that room knew, not Holden, not Blair, not Tess with her tire backpack and her half-finished sketchbook page, was that a man named Phil DaCosta had been standing near the east wall with his phone out since approximately 7:10. Phil was a freelance automotive journalist who covered restoration events for 3 regional publications, and he had started recording because something felt wrong and he wanted documentation in case it escalated. It was 19 minutes of footage. He posted it at 11:38 p.m. with a caption that read, "Watched a man get interrogated for half an hour in front of his 9-year-old daughter tonight, while trying to attend an event honoring his own work. Judge for yourself. No hashtags. No framing." By 3 a.m. it had 4 million views. By morning, 14. By the end of the second day, 31 million. The clip of Blair telling Tess she didn't belong was the one being shared in pieces. That 11-second exchange, looped and reposted, the specific moment a grown adult told a child with a tire backpack that she was in the wrong place. The comment sections filled with people who recognized something in it. People who had worn the wrong jacket to the wrong meeting. People who had carried the wrong bag into the wrong room. People who had watched a door close before they'd reached it and understood, in the way you understand things that happen to your body, that the closing had nothing to do with what was on the other side of them. Some of them if they were being honest, recognized something in Blair too. Blair didn't sleep that night. She was at her desk at 5:15 a.m., 3 monitors open, watching numbers that had stopped meaning anything normal to her sometime around 1 a.m. Her events director called at 6:02, then her PR contact, then the chairman of the Harrington Club's board, who had the voice of a man who had been in difficult situations before and was not panicking, which was the only reason she didn't. By 8:30, she had canceled 3 meetings, postponed a contract review, and was sitting in the back of a car on the way to a conversation she had not yet decided how to have with herself. The thing she kept coming back to, the thing she could not route around, was the 11-second clip, not because of the numbers, because of Tess. Because she had looked at that child standing next to a man who made things with his hands and had decided, in the space of one look, that the child didn't belong. She had not been asked to make that decision. Nobody had put her there and told her to make it. She had walked across that hall under her own power and used her own words. She found, in the comment section around 7 a.m., a post from a woman who had simply written, "I've been this woman in a different room. I didn't know it until I saw it from the outside. It's an awful thing to see. It had been liked more than anything else." Blair read it 3 times. Then she put her phone face down on the car seat and looked out the window at Nashville in the early morning, and tried to figure out who she was going to be on the other side of this. Holden read about the video on his phone in the garage parking lot at 6:45 a.m., sitting on the tailgate of his truck before opening up for the day. Kira had sent him a link the night before with a message that said, "See this when Tess isn't around." He watched it once through. Then he called Kira. "How bad?" he said. "Depends on what you're worried about," she said. "Pemberton's office called at 7:30 last night. He'd seen it. He wants to keep the meeting on." "Good. What about Blair Weston?" "Appears to be having a very difficult morning." He looked at the garage. The sign above the door read Keane Restorations in plain black lettering. He'd painted it himself 3 years ago on a Saturday while Tess handed him the brush. "I want to see what she does first," he said. "And if she goes quiet and lawyers up, then we figure out the next step. But let's see." He went inside and opened the garage. At 11:15 that morning, a man named Ted Harrow, senior scheduling coordinator for the Harrington Club, 12-year employee, was called into a meeting with the club's general manager. He had spent the past 18 hours convincing himself that nobody was going to look closely enough. He had been wrong. The club's internal review had begun at 6 a.m. By 9:30, the operations team had found something that shouldn't have been there. An external modification to the featured guest registration file made 11 days before the event that had removed the confirmation code attached to Holden Keane's name. Not deleted, moved to a secondary archive where the event desk software wouldn't surface it in a standard search. Someone who knew the system, someone with access. Ted Harrow had a secondary income, a consulting arrangement through a company called Crestline Advisory Partners, which had been paying him quarterly for 8 months. Crestline Advisory Partners, when the club's legal team traced it, was a pass-through entity. Its primary client was a man named Felix Strand. Felix Strand was 49, based in Atlanta, and ran a restoration company called Strand Heritage Group that had been attempting for the previous 2 years to position itself as the preferred partner for the American Automotive Heritage Foundation. He had made a formal proposal to August Pemberton's office 14 months ago. He had been declined. He had followed up twice and been declined twice. He had then, according to documentation that Pemberton had found distasteful enough to preserve, suggested that the foundation might want to perform additional vetting on any independent craftsman it considered for featured partnerships. He had also heard, through the small, close world of the restoration community, that Holden Keane had a temper, that he was difficult under pressure, that he would not handle a confrontation calmly. Someone had fed Felix Strand this information. It was not accurate, but it was useful to someone building something specific. Because if you wanted footage of Holden Keane losing control in front of an audience, what you needed was someone at the door who would make the wrong assumption, hold it long enough to create friction, and trust that Keane would eventually snap. You needed someone like Blair, and whoever had arranged it and whoever had arranged it had been right about everything except the one variable that mattered: the man they were trying to break. Blair found the documentation 11 hours after the video hit 30 million views in a conference room in her own office building, reading through what the Harrington Club's legal team had assembled and handed to her without comment. She sat with it for a long time after the last page. She had spent the past day feeling like the sole author of what had happened at that registration desk. She was the author of it. She had made every choice she'd made. Nobody had walked her across that hall and put words in her mouth. Nobody had engineered the expression on her face when she'd looked at Holden's jacket. Those were hers. But someone had looked at her from a distance and decided she was exactly the right instrument for a particular purpose. Someone had removed the one piece of information that might have given her pause. Someone had bet that she would do exactly what she'd done. They had been right. That was the part she had to sit with. She picked up her phone. She had Holden Keane's contact in the client file system. She looked at the number for a while. Then she dialed before she could change her mind. It rang twice. Keane. "This is Blair Weston," she said. "I have 2 things to tell you, and I'm going to say them in order. The first one is personal." A pause, not hostile, all right. "I want to say directly that I'm sorry for what I said to your daughter. Not as a club representative. As a person who looked at a 9-year-old girl and told her she didn't belong somewhere she had every right to be. I've thought about that since last night, and her voice wavered slightly. She steadied it. "I'm genuinely sorry. Not because this is bad for me professionally, because it was wrong." The silence on his end lasted a few seconds. "I hear you," he said. "The second thing is something you need to know." She told him everything. Ted Harrow, the registration file modification, Crestline Advisory Partners, Felix Strand, all of it. She talked for 8 minutes. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet long enough that she thought she'd lost the call. "You're telling me this," he said finally, "before your lawyers know you're doing it." "Yes." "Why?" She had thought about this while she was sitting with the documents, while the city went dark outside the window, while she was trying to figure out who she wanted to be on the other side of this. "Because you were the one who got hurt," she said. "You and Tess. And whatever Strand is still planning, you can't stop it if you don't know it's happening." She paused. "And because I was the instrument he used, even if I helped more than I should have, that means I have some part in making it right." He was quiet again. "Can you send me the documentation? I'll have it to Kira Dalton by tonight." "Blair." "Yes." "This is going to be complicated for you," he said. "Strand has resources. He's going to know you turned this over." "I know that." "Your career at the club." "I know," she said. "I know what it could cost. I'm doing it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. She heard what might have been a wrench set down, the background sounds of a working garage. "Thank you," he said. "I want to be straight with you about that. What you're doing matters." "I'm not asking for anything from you," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "That's part of why it matters." The line was quiet for a moment. "How's Tess?" Blair said. A pause. "She asked me this morning whether the Cobra was faster than the Mustang." Something in his voice shifted slightly. Not warm exactly, but no longer guarded. "She's okay." Something loosened in Blair's chest that she hadn't known was wound tight. "Good," she said. "That's good." She hung up and set the phone on the table and noticed that her hands were not entirely steady. Felix Strand was indicted on a Wednesday in early November. The charges included wire fraud, conspiracy to interfere with a commercial contract, and criminal tampering with business records. That last charge carried considerably more weight because the registration file modification, when traced forensically, had passed through a system regulated under Tennessee Commercial Code in ways the U.S. Attorney's Office found clearly actionable. Ted Harrow had called Blair's attorney on a Friday night, 8 days after his termination, and said he wanted to cooperate. He confirmed that through the Crestline intermediary, he had been told the arrangement was standard competitive intelligence. He confirmed being told specifically that Holden Keane had a temper, a piece of fabricated intelligence, fed into the arrangement to increase the likelihood that a confrontation would escalate. He confirmed he had known it wasn't right. He cooperated anyway. When Kira read the transcript section about the temper, she called Holden immediately. "Someone told Strand you lose your cool under pressure," she said. A pause on his end. "That's interesting," he said very quietly. "They built the whole thing on it," Kira said. "The footage was supposed to show you exploding. Not Blair being wrong. You being exactly what they'd decided you were." He didn't say anything for a moment. "He bet against my character," Holden said. "Yes." "And lost." "Yes," Kira said again. When he finally spoke, his voice had the particular flatness of someone who is feeling something too wide to fit into words and has decided not to try. "Make sure Blair's cooperation is noted in the record," he said. "Whatever happens to her professionally, I want it noted." Kira wrote it down. The Harrington Club's board reinstated Blair's position 2 months later, not by unanimous vote. The margin was narrow enough to be uncomfortable, but with conditions she had agreed to because she found them reasonable. She spent those 2 months doing something she had not done in 3 years of running events. She had individual conversations with every member of her staff. 31 people, 30 minutes each. She heard things she had not known. Some of it was uncomfortable. Some of it explained patterns she'd been watching in client satisfaction data for over a year without understanding the source. She found that her systems were good at catching the problems she had thought to look for. They were poor at catching everything else. The partnership between Keane Restorations and the American Automotive Heritage Foundation closed on a Thursday afternoon in Pemberton's Memphis office. No ceremony. A signed document, 2 lawyers, a handshake. Pemberton looked at Holden across the table after everything was signed and said, without preamble, "Your wife would have liked this." Holden didn't know exactly how Pemberton had known enough about Sarah to say that. He assumed Kira had mentioned her at some point. He assumed it was a kind thing said by a man who meant it kindly. "Yeah," he said, "she would have." He flew back to Millhaven that evening and opened the garage the next morning at 7 o'clock the same way he opened it every morning. The Keane Restoration Fellowship launched the following March at a community college in Millhaven. Not a ballroom, not a hotel, a workshop space, fluorescent lights, the smell of metal and solvent, folding chairs set up on a concrete floor that had grease stains from 20 years of students learning things with their hands. 14 people sat in the front rows. Most of them were single parents. Most of them had spent years learning a craft in places and ways that didn't produce the right resume or the right handshake or the right look at the right moment. Some of them had been passed over for apprenticeships they'd deserved. Some of them had walked into rooms and had doors close before they'd reached them and had understood, in the way you understand things that happen to your body, that the closing had nothing to do with what was on the other side of them. Holden spoke without notes. He talked about what it meant to know things that don't show until you're allowed to use them. He talked about the first car he'd rebuilt as a teenager in his uncle's driveway in Akron. A Datsun 240Z with a cracked frame that everyone had told him wasn't worth the hours. He'd driven it for 4 years after. He talked about Sarah, not long. Just enough to say she had worked 2 jobs while finishing a degree in mechanical engineering that nobody had told her she was capable of finishing, and that she had been the most competent person he'd ever known, and that she'd never once stopped to wonder whether she deserved to be in the room she was in. He paused. "This is for her," he said. "Everything I build is for her." Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. He was near the end when Tess walked onto the stage. She had been sitting in the front row with her sketchbook. She had not announced she was going to do this. Holden had stopped being surprised by the things Tess did without announcing them. She crossed to where he was standing and looked up at him. "Dad," she said, into the microphone because he was still holding it. "Yeah. When that woman told me to leave the room." She said it with the directness of a kid who has been thinking about something for months and has finally found the right moment. "And you stayed calm. How did you do that?" The room was very still. Holden looked at his daughter, at the tire backpack she'd set in her chair, at the future mechanic shirt visible at the collar of her jacket, at the sketchbook in her hand with 14 versions of the Mustang in it by now. "I was looking at you," he said. She waited. "When someone treats you badly, you get to choose what you do next. Anger is fast and it feels like something, but it burns off and then it's gone, and what's left is just whatever you did while you were in it. He paused. Dignity is slower. It doesn't burn off. It stays, and it builds on itself, and people remember it a lot longer than they remember the anger. Tess thought about this. She was doing the face she made when she was actually processing something rather than forming a quick opinion. Did you feel dignified? She asked. Honestly? He almost smiled. No. I felt tired and I really wanted to get to the car, but I acted dignified, and that's the part you actually get to control, not the feeling, just the action. She nodded once. The nod of someone for whom this is answered something they'd been carrying for a while. Okay, she said. She walked back off the stage the way she'd come. Unhurried, her sketchbook under her arm, as though this had been a scheduled item on the evening's program, and she was satisfied with how it had gone. The room began to clap. It grew. Blair Weston was in the audience. She had not told anyone she was coming. She had called Kira Dalton 2 weeks before the event and asked, without framing it as anything other than what it was, whether her presence would be unwelcome. Kira had checked and called back within the day. It was fine. She sat 8 rows back in a seat she'd arrived early enough to choose. Dark gray, hair down, dressed to not be noticed. She watched Holden talk about the Datsun, about the craft, about the people in those front rows who deserved what was being built for them. She watched his face when he said Sarah's name. She watched Tess walk onto the stage. She heard the question. She heard the answer. The part that stayed with her, the part she kept returning to on the drive home through the Tennessee dark, was not the composed version of the story. It was the honest one. I felt tired, and I really wanted to get to the car. The part that cost something. The part that was real. You could not replicate serenity you didn't feel. But you could choose how you acted inside the feelings you had. She understood, sitting in that folding chair in that fluorescent-lit room, that this was the thing she had been missing. Not the capability to manage difficult situations. She'd always had that. But the understanding that managing a difficult situation was a choice made against the grain of what you were feeling, not a character trait that made the feeling absent. The feeling was always there. The choice was what mattered. After the ceremony, she waited near the side exit while the crowd thinned. Holden found her, or came close enough to the door that they were in the same space, which might have been the same thing. You came, he said. I did. She looked at him. The thing about your wife, she said it carefully. She sounds like she was extraordinary. He looked at the middle distance for a moment. She was impatient, he said. She had terrible map-reading instincts and refused to admit it, and she was the person who told me, when I had 12 employees and no contracts worth anything, that what I was building was real and I should act like it. He paused. I don't know if any of this exists without that. Blair didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would have been better than leaving it there. After a moment, Tess appeared from somewhere to Holden's left, in the way she seemed to appear, instantaneously, with her backpack and her sketchbook and her hair half out of its ponytail. She looked at Blair. You're the lady from the club, she said. Not a question, not an accusation, a fact organized. Yes, Blair said. Tess studied her for a moment with those steady eyes. You said sorry, she said. I did. And then you told my dad about the guy who messed up his reservation. Yes. Because it was right, Tess said. Yes. Tess appeared to evaluate this with the same seriousness she applied to engine schematics and questions about whether roly-polies could feel kindness. Then she said, my dad says that's the part you can control, not how you feel, just what you do next. I know, Blair said. I heard him say it tonight. Are you going to remember it? Blair looked at this 9-year-old girl with the future mechanic shirt and the wrench keychain attached to her backpack and the sketchbook that probably had a new version of the Mustang started on the last page. Yeah, she said, I really am. Tess nodded once, apparently satisfied, and turned back toward Holden. I want to find the cookie table before it's gone, she said. I saw pecan ones. Go ahead, he said. She disappeared into the crowd. Holden and Blair stood at the edge of the room for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who had met under the worst possible circumstances and were still somehow standing in the same space. The fellowship is real, Blair said. What you're building here. It's a start, he said. For what it's worth, she paused. I'm glad you didn't lose your temper. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. So am I, he said. She said goodnight and walked out into the March evening. She got in her car and sat for a moment before starting it. She thought about the front rows. 14 people who had needed a specific door to open at a specific time. She thought about what it would take to build something that caught what existing systems missed. Not the problems you had thought to look for, but the ones that fell outside every category you'd already built. She thought about the reflex she was still working on, the one that ran below conscious thought and wore the costume of professionalism and called itself instinct. She was catching it earlier now. The gap between the reflex and the choice was getting smaller. It was not gone. She did not think it would ever be fully gone. But smaller was something. Smaller was where the real work lived. She started the car. Inside, Holden was looking for Tess. He found her at the refreshment table with a plate of pecan cookies and a new acquaintance. The daughter of one of the fellowship recipients, maybe 7 years old, who was listening with great attention to Tess explain the difference between a pushrod engine and an overhead cam. He stood at the edge of the room and listened to his daughter explain something she loved to a kid who hadn't known it existed until 30 seconds ago. The kid asked a question. Tess answered it with the patience of someone who has decided this conversation is worth her time. She looked up and found Holden watching her. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Can we get breakfast in the morning? The good place with the biscuits." He looked at her, this particular impossible kid with the undone ponytail and the tire backpack and the wrench keychain and the patient, serious eyes that missed very little and forgave more than she'd been taught to. "Yeah," he said, "the good place with the biscuits." They walked out together into the ordinary March night, and the door swung closed behind them, and inside, 14 people were beginning something that hadn't existed before that evening. Something small and honest and grounded, the kind of thing that starts in a folding chair under fluorescent lights and becomes, if the people inside it mean it, something that outlasts the room it was built in.